Welcome to Mythbusters Dyslexia Edition. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education.
Hi, I'm Faith Borkowsky, High Five Literacy and Academic Coaching. I'm a Certified Dyslexia Practitioner.
Today we are taking the time to debunk some of these myths surrounding dyslexia. Everyone who struggles with reading has dyslexia. Well, this is a huge myth because there are several reasons to struggle with reading, and they're not strictly related to dyslexia. Dyslexia in the 80s and 90s was kind of used as an umbrella term for anyone that struggled with reading. But if we look at the definition of dyslexia, it tells us that it's not anyone who struggles with reading. And there are individuals that can be excluded from someone with dyslexia. For example, there are the reluctant readers and the students that haven't had the right instruction to give them the ability to read. And these students are ones with, a little bit of intensive appropriate intervention. They're going to learn how to read quite quickly. And those are not individuals who have dyslexia.
Yeah, and I see that all the time. And I can always tell who they are once I start working with them. It becomes apparent because those are the ones when you just show them how words work, they will pick it up rather quickly. You see that this is not a long process, that they just never were told, they were never taught explicitly. And once you show them, they're able to read the words. And then you have those kids where they need multiple times of working this through, trying it again and again. And so I could always tell that the ones who need a lot of practice clearly are the ones who have something more than just not being taught.
For sure. And then there are the students that don't struggle with reading, but they struggle with understanding what they're reading. And those students don't have dyslexia. They may have a specific learning disability in reading, but it's not dyslexia. It has to do with the comprehension and understanding side of the equation.
Yeah, so then you have those kids with language difficulties. So some of them have difficulties piecing information together in a book, where they might read a line and then forget what they read, or they're not making the connection with the next line. So rather than taking it holistically and having something build, by the time they get to the end of the page, they either already forgot or they're not making the connections between the different parts of a story. So that's definitely a language issue, whether it's the vocabulary, whether it's expanded language structure, where it's complex sentence structure. They have difficulty being able to bring all the pieces together, hold on to it, and then make those different connections.
Definitely. And the thing is, so an individual with dyslexia can struggle with reading comprehension, and oftentimes it has to do with their access to the text. So a student who's struggling with reading and is having to sound out every word they come across, or a high majority of them, they don't have the working memory or the ability to hold that information in their head, because the effort they need to read that word takes so much of their attention. They forget the stuff that's come before it, and trying to tie it all together is very difficult.
Yeah, I talk about that in my book, Failing Students or Failing Schools, A Parent's Guide to Reading Instruction and Intervention, where I mention the working memory piece and how difficult it is to, first be able to pick the words up off the page, then be able to hold on to a thought, process it, move on, then be able to understand all the connections between pronouns and proper nouns and be able to make the connections from one part to another. It's very difficult. And as reading becomes harder and they're reading difficult material that's not something that's in their background knowledge, it becomes almost impossible for some of them.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of things when it comes to dyslexia that we need to think about. And I was just going to take a moment to read the definition of dyslexia that's used by the International Dyslexia Association. And it says that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties are typically the result of a deficit in phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So these are all things that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about students on whether they meet the diagnostic criteria for dyslexia. So those students that we talked about in the beginning that are going to have that quick response to effective instruction are not meeting the category or the diagnostic criteria of dyslexia because it's persistent. If you have an individual that is struggling with understanding the text and only understanding the text, again, they're not meeting the criteria. But as it mentioned, it can be a secondary criteria of having that comprehension issue. So if they are struggling with the reading, they likely will still struggle with the comprehension. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what it is. So someone who struggles with reading doesn't necessarily have dyslexia, but they may if they meet these other criteria.
Yes, and that's important because I have parents who will come to me and the first thing they'll say is, oh, my child has a reading comprehension problem. And yes, it did manifest into a reading comprehension problem. But if you go back and you really peel away all the parts to what goes into reading comprehension, many times you will see there are these underlying problems, these deficit areas that then will end up being a reading comprehension problem, as you said, a secondary consequence, and I bring that up too in my books.
All right. The next one is dyslexia can be outgrown. And so obviously, like through my things, I was told I was cured of dyslexia. And that caused huge problems for me because I'm like, what do you mean I'm cured? I still struggle. Like, yes, I can read words somewhat fluently, but I'm not cured. So I definitely want to touch on that. You should never tell a dyslexic that they're cured because yes, they may be able to decode and read, but that doesn't mean they don't suffer from the other issues.
Yeah, so there are so many things that go into this. So we talked about sequencing. Yeah. In our other interview, and how you will see children who struggle with auditory memory, holding pieces of information together. That does not go away. That's something that many kids struggle with, even once you teach them to decode, and even if they get up to adequate levels of fluency where they're able to understand what they read. Those are the things that just don't go away. Having to repeat directions and be able to break directions down into digestible pieces. That doesn't go away so quickly.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up because no, if there's a genetic component to this, that's not just going to magically disappear. You can certainly get kids to read, and many dyslexic children can become quite good at reading. Where they're fine. They're able to read. They could read for enjoyment. They could read to understand academic material. But those types of struggles, whether it's naming, recalling words, being able to process information and hold on to it. What was that?
I'll say the myth and we'll actually do it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
This is something that I want to talk about in this myth. This isn't actually doing about it. And one of the things that I was going to bring up is, I don't know if you saw it in October, but I said, hi, my name is Kathryn Garforth and I'm severely dyslexic. And one thing that I want to say is that, yes, I can read, but I can't read fast enough to read subtitles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. Yeah.
Because I talked about pulling up a video from NASA, and I was really excited because it was talking about finding water on the moon, but then it was all text slides, and I couldn't read it fast enough. And I'm trying to show it to my kids, and they're right beside me. I'm like, okay, we're going to have to pause there.
Right.
I'm a pure dyslexic, but I still struggle.
Sure.
Okay. Dyslexia can be outgrown. Now, this is definitely a myth, because while you may be able to teach a dyslexic so that they can read, and they can read at an appropriate grade level, that's not necessarily going to fix all the other issues or problems related to dyslexia. For example, someone with dyslexia may still continue to struggle with their phonological awareness and the ability to discriminate between similar words in rapid progression. And even when they're trying to retrieve words, they may, make subtle mistakes and say Craig instead of Greg, or Braden instead of Brandon. Things like this that are common and happen, and people just think it's an intelligence thing, when really it's not. It's part of their dyslexia.
Yeah, absolutely. So just what you said, such children could have these words in their head, and then by the time it comes out twisted, or not the word that they intended to use, but it sounds similar. So that's what comes out. And for somebody who doesn't know, like you said, that person could assume, oh, that person doesn't have a very good vocabulary, or doesn't understand because they're using the words incorrectly. But really, they have the words, they just can't seem to process those sounds and get it out in the right order. So it's a very good point.
Yeah. And children or individuals with dyslexia, even though they can read, there may be issues with reading fluency. And while they can read and decode and comprehend and understand what they're reading, it'll take them longer to do that. And they can take away all the information that they need to, and that a non-dyslexic individual would get from the text. It just takes them longer. And we see these issues when people are asked to read test information in testing. So that's why individuals with dyslexia will often get the accommodation of time and a half, or the use of a reader for assignments and reading textbooks. They'll get an audio version of the text, not because they can't read the text, but the time that it would take them to read it is extenuating. It's so much longer than it would be for another person. So it's more efficient for the support. And even when it comes to reading subtitles in movies, or reading text in a PowerPoint presentation, they don't have the time to process it.
Yes. So, I want to bring something up about accommodations, because I am all for children being able to receive accommodations, but I don't believe that the accommodations should be used in place of instruction. And in schools, you will see that there's this confusion where kids are getting accommodations, and then it's like, okay, that's enough. They have this, they have assistive technology, they have extra time, they have a scribe. Well, no reason to have to teach handwriting now. So I want to just make that very clear that it's important to advocate for accommodations. But that is in addition to being able to give kids instruction so that they could have a chance of doing these things themselves, even if it takes a little bit longer for them to do. We shouldn't think that, we should skip that step altogether. It's not important. So I'm glad you brought that up about accommodations.
Yeah. And, there are other things that you don't outgrow, and it is a neurobiological disorder, right? So it's a brain-based disorder, and it has to do with your ability to retrieve things and organize things, talk about things. And these are things that aren't going to go away. And yes, when you finish high school and formal education, you may be able to select a path for your life that doesn't highlight these areas of struggle, but it doesn't mean that they still don't exist.
Yeah, so I could tell you that a lot of kids with dyslexia, they go into different careers where they don't have to constantly read or write. They go into careers that maybe are more artistic, creative, putting things together, architects or engineers, where they're able to kind of see the big picture. And so you will see, some of that is true, where you will see kids who will gravitate to those careers. However, I want to say that is a myth that those kids are only able to do those things. Because, for instance, my publisher, Don Wynn, who published Failing Students or Failing Schools, A Parent's Guide to Reading Instruction and Intervention, is dyslexic himself. And he is an author of children's books and a publisher. And yes, does he need some help perhaps with editing and pointing out certain things that maybe other people would not have trouble with, perhaps, but he is extremely creative and could put together a great story, and he's a writer. So, and there are others out there who also choose writing as a career, even though you would think that those people would shy away from something like that. So although I would say more people will go into careers that do not highlight their difficulties, there are some people who fight their way through it and stick with it and just get help when they need help.
Exactly. And the main point that we're trying to get across here is that dyslexia is not outgrown and it's not cured. So please try to avoid saying those things to an individual with dyslexia, because it's a way of saying, oh, you're fixed and we don't care if you still experience it. Like we're considering you better.